In this video we're going to look at the stages of a forest succession. So if you're planning on growing a food forest, this will come in really handy. And if you are looking to design a permaculture garden, then this is also going to come in handy. It doesn't matter what stage you get to, even if you don't want a forest, it's still going to help you understand your ecosystem. So the first stage of the forest succession, so basically what we're talking about here is from almost like a bare piece of land to a forest. So the first stage is the pioneering stage, and these are mainly annuals. It could also look like rock as well, your land, and it could also be quite dusty. So it'll look a little bit like this. The next stage would be the perennial plants and the grasses, so your kind of like smaller shrubs. So anybody who doesn't know what a perennial plant is, basically the definition of it is a plant that lasts longer than 7 years. They're a bit different from annuals, which supposedly you are supposed to dig up every year. I think that annuals were derived from perennials. And I think that was done because of the intensive farming, the way we farm now. And yeah, I'll do another video about deciduous plants, evergreens, etc., and we'll delve more into that. The next stage of the forest succession is shrubs and woody pioneers. So sorry, the perennial plant stage is just going to look a bit higher, right? A little bit like that. And the shrubby and woody pioneer stage is going to look like small kind of tree saplings that have grown maybe a few years. Like so. The next stage would be short-lived pioneer trees, which is basically a young forest. And short-lived in this scenario just means that they have lived for a short amount of time, not specifically that there's trees that are short-lived, that have short lives naturally. Again, a bit bigger now. Basically the forest is starting to take shape. And the last stage would be the climax forest stage, which is a mature forest. So this is the ideal scenario. This is where the forest is most productive. To get to this stage, from this stage, you're probably looking at about, I mean, people say from 100, 200 to 250 years. For me, I've seen forests which are, you know, at the young stage at around 30 years, and that's in a temperate climate. And yeah, so I hope that gives you an understanding of like an overview of how to actually the different stages of a forest as well, and the different stages. Maybe you can now understand the stage that your garden is at as well. So I also want to show you the what we're looking for in our projects, in our permaculture projects, what we're looking for in terms of effort and results. Because I mean, here is like a monoculture basically, or a culture that is not that productive, and so right here we're looking at a lot of effort, so a lot of inputs. If we, for example, if we were here and we wanted to get to there, then we would be looking at putting a lot of inputs in at this stage for not a lot of results. So what I'm going to speak to you now about is the 80-20 principle, and you might have heard this in a lot of business scenarios. I personally learned it from business, but exactly the same applies to permaculture. So 80-20, 80-20, and it applies to all life. In this scenario, we're talking about effort and results. So at this stage, at the pioneering stage, we're looking at putting 80% effort for 20% of the results. At the climax forest stage, we'll be looking at 20% effort for 80% of the results. So, the reason for this is because in permaculture we design systems that require minimal intervention, minimal input by us. Now, at the start of a project, you're always going to be putting in heaps more effort for a lack of results, and that is just how things work. And yeah, so at the start of your projects, you're going to be putting in a lot of effort. There'll be a lot of designing that needs to be done, and your initial implementations are going to be big changes, especially if your land is very barren, especially if you've got like hillside land that needs terraced in, for example. If you're doing any kind of restructuring to the soil, to the landscape, then a lot of effort is going to be needed. But even for like no dig beds, I mean, it takes a lot of effort to put these together. Raised bed systems, any retaining wall structure, so anything structural is going to take a lot of implementation. It's going to take a lot of effort, and you're not going to see the results until the next spring, for example. But they're really valid things to do, and they're definitely integral parts of the design, because like anything, if you haven't got the foundations sorted, then the project and the outcome is going to be a lot different than if you had solid foundations to work with. And I'll be doing another video about how to manipulate the land in such a way that it gives the best types of growing and best and most efficient and effective way of growing. So just before I finish this video, I wanted to show you one last thing, which was the graph which refers to this and the 80-20 principle. Okay, so like I said, in any project you're going to be putting in a lot of effort at the start for minimal results. So it will more than likely look like this. So here we have the results. So the results going up, right? And so this can be, for example, like your yields. So your yields from your veg, your yields from your flowers, and here we have time. And slash effort as well. Another way to draw this graph actually would be, so the green is actually effort. And the black here is actually results. Okay. So at the start of our projects, we're going to be putting in a lot of effort for minimal results. And so referring to the 80-20 principle, so 80% of our work is up here, and 20% of the results down here. And then as time moves forward, as we implement our strategic and conscious designs, we will receive 80% of the results for 20% of the effort. And this is the ideal scenario. This is what we want to get to, right? So that we're not inputting effort, but also resources as well. So we're not spending heaps of money on resources. This is how we've observed nature. So we've observed how a forest works, and we've realized that actually, wow, like this forest doesn't need a lot of inputs from other places. You know, it might get its inputs from a bird dropping seeds on the floor from another forest, for example, and the manure and feces from animals which are passing through the forest, and the forest is then using that, breaking it down to fertilize its the ecosystem. So that's where it's getting its inputs from, is stuff like this, and also rivers flowing through the forest. But actually they're really minimal inputs when you compare that to how we handle our farming these days, which is intensive monoculture farming, which requires heavy inputs, extremely heavy inputs, because they're all annuals, and they need, because they haven't used the guild structure, they need heaps of inputs from, and this is, whereas on the other hand they could have used plants which would have given the soil that nutrient that it needed, instead of putting it in from other sources, and that requires a lot of effort. But also, if we look at how we farm with the big machines as well, and how much money that takes to buy them, and the petrol, the fuel, the diesel that it costs to run the engines, and also all the maintenance that comes with that, etc. And because there's no reshaping of the land and conscious decision making of that land, makes it a lot harder to farm. So that's why in permaculture we observe the land first, analyse it, create detailed designs to best grow on this land for the most effective and efficient growing, so that one day our farm or our homestead or our garden will only require 20% of the effort for 80% of the results. So taking this example, the example we did previously about the forest, and how to get from an annual or bare ground, a degraded ground, to a mature, thriving, productive forest, exactly the same is happening here. Even if it was without our input and nature just did its thing, it would still be looking like this. And yeah, I just wanted to mention something here. So basically, once you get to a climax of the forest, the productivity doesn't move unless a vigorous plant then overcomes the current plants that are in the ecosystem, and therefore creating an unproductive environment. So if we take the red, so this is where it becomes degenerative. And this is just one option a forest could take. If the forest was handled in a way where there was animals or humans that were tending to the forest consciously, then this wouldn't happen. So in the Amazon rainforest, for example, the forest hasn't, the jungle hasn't degraded, because it has animals which are actually how they live naturally. They're doing what they do naturally, but they're tending the forest, and this means that the forest can continue to be productive, and therefore keeping that level of productivity. So if we go, vigorous. You might find an example of this that you relate to in the forests in England, if you're in England, which are overrun by brambles, for example. Brambles are extremely vigorous, and once they overrun a part of the forest, it actually lacks diversity because there's less plants in that specific area, and so basically it takes on similar characteristics of a monoculture, because it's taken a certain nutrient from the soil and it's not providing that back, and there's no other plants to provide that back because it's been too vigorous and it's shaded the plants out, or it's just overgrown them and the plant can't survive anymore. Maybe it's not getting enough sunlight, for example. So that's where the the forest would degenerate. So you hear a lot about sustainability these days, and here we can say that this is sustaining. Here this is sustaining, right? It is sustaining the productivity. Sustainability means able to sustain a straight line, for example, or sustain a momentum, sustain an ecosystem. So if an ecosystem is sustainable, it basically means that it's not regenerating and it's not degenerating, so it's almost stagnating. So it's saying exactly the same. In this scenario it's good. So if something's up here and it's sustaining or stagnating, then it is a good thing. But I hear a lot these days about becoming sustainable and that being the ultimate goal. Actually, we need to rejuvenate before we can sustain. So here we're looking at rejuvenation. Rejuvenation, and then we can sustain. But if we look to sustain first, then we are basically settling for less, and we are settling for an ecosystem that is not as productive as it could potentially be. So the idea is not to sustain when we're down here. The idea is first to rejuvenate and then sustain. So I hope that makes sense, and yeah, if you have any questions, please feel free to let me know. And yeah, thank you so much for watching, and if you have anything that you want me to speak about as well, I'm more than happy to do so. So yeah, please give me a message or comment. Thank you very much.